Da-da-da. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. Sorry to disrupt the conversation. I'll do this one time because it makes me feel so powerful, and Andre could do it. So, and I haven't had a chance to do it with everyone. So, are you ready? Together. Wow. Andre's so powerful. Tanse, Tawao Kakiao, Justin Tsigasan, Machuf Napiao Nia, Saskatoon Otsinia. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Justin. I'm a proud member of the PFC boards. I work at Mastercard Foundation for income, and I'm a proud Métis citizen from Saskatchewan. I grew up in my territories in Saskatchewan. I'm also like uncomfortably tall for this small thing, and I have like the opposite effect. Those who saw Rita on the first day, she had this like giant lifter. I need the opposite. I need like a whatever is the opposite of lifter. We're headed into a really awesome conversation. I'm going to ramble on for a bit before I introduce these two brilliant, smart folks. First, I want to start also by acknowledging, I know Elder Verna was just with us on day one, but acknowledge and thank her for her words, as well as my adopted brother, Brian. I don't know if he's in the room, but for some reason, he decided he wanted to talk to me every month, and so we have like monthly calls, and we tell stories and talk about how awesome the sector could be and the cool work that we're doing. So I'm fortunate to have built a relationship with Brian, and so I'm really appreciative of those two opening us up in a really powerful and good way. I aspire one day to be the kind of elder like Verna that can get up here and like drop like truth bombs, you know? She's like just giving you the detail, the nitty gritty of how awful colonialism is and blah, blah, blah. And she makes everyone laugh at the same time. So one day I'll get there. I'm pleased to introduce our closing plenary entitled Cultivating Inclusive Communities and Connections for the Road Ahead. We all know philanthropy contributes to the strengthening of the social fabric in our society, whether it be through programs, investments, grants, thought leadership, social capital, all those things that we've been talking about over the last few days. But like many sectors, it's being tested, it's being challenged with new and intractable challenges, from racism to polarization and instability here and around the world. We also know that philanthropy is far from perfect. I'm sure we've had some of those conversations over the last couple days. And I encourage all of us to reflect on both how far we've come as a sector, but how far we have to go as we continue to move from merely a vision of charity, you know, doing a little good, giving back to feel good, to a lens and a mission of justice, where all people here and around the world can prosper. Oh, wow. Ooh, nice. Love a clap. So we have these two awesome folks who are joining us. Meredith, Preston, McGhie, Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism, and Mohammed, Hashim, Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, are here to share some insights, personal stories on these issues and themes to help us reflect on those learnings and inspire us ahead as we continue down that path towards justice. I'm gonna read your bios, and then I'll hand it to you guys. So Meredith, Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism. Previously, she mediated and advised on a range of mediation processes as the Regional Director for Africa with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And before that, she was with the UN. She served as an advisor for Kofi Annan during the Kenya National Dialogue and Reconciliation. Through more than 20 years in Africa, she helped to establish and facilitate peace processes in Nigeria, Somalia, Sudan and South Sudan, and elsewhere. She contributes to policy discussions on peacemaking globally, including teaching on inclusion and peace processes. Round of applause for her. Come on. Excited. We have Mohammed as well, the CEO and Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. He's worked as a human rights advocate in Canada for the past 2 decades. He has dedicated his career to supporting equity, inclusion, and community empowerment, has contributed to various legislative and policy agendas to prevent and address racism and hate in Canada. particular, as CEO of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, Mohammed leads the National Hate Crimes Task Force with the RCMP to better understand the systemic challenges and gaps in addressing hate crimes and incidents in Canada, to support communities and to equip policing services to prevent, investigate, and support prosecutions related to hate crimes. So I'm going to hand it over to them, but just so everyone knows, I hope you've used the CVent app. Has everyone used the CVent app? Wow, look at that. Tech-enabled, PFC tech-enabled conference. So after these two dig into the discussion, you're stuck with me. I'll come back up here and facilitate a conversation through the questions asked in the app. So as you go, it's open now. Feel free to add questions as we go, and we'll have some time after to dig into the discussion. To start off the chat with a question, how can we strengthen the social fabric of our society by cultivating inclusive connections between each other and the communities we serve? Thank you.
Thanks,
Let's give him a round of
Justin.
applause.
So Mohammed's just told me I have to start. And I have to say first, thank you to the organizers that you've taken a huge risk putting Mohammed and I up here with no moderator to stop us, so we might be here for a while. You know, it's always a bit hard, I think, to be able to close out these things. I know you guys have all had an incredibly rich set of discussions over these last few days, and you're asking us a pretty huge question as well. And then, of course, we were given the advice by the organizers, which I have a love-hate relationship with, which is tell some personal stories. And it always feels a little bit hard to figure out how we encapsulate that and how we hold that. So I thought I'd just kick off with a couple of reflections and just thinking a little bit about where I've come at this space and these questions of inclusive communities. As you heard from my bio, my background is in mediation and peace processes, but I now lead the Global Center for Pluralism. And you know, I think just a word to say that one of the things that I found really powerful about pluralism as a concept is it kind of helps us come back to first principles when we're thinking about questions of inclusion. It takes us back to questions of belonging and what it actually means to double down on belonging in communities, in organizations, in societies that we're working in. And what does that actually mean? And it doesn't just mean that I get to belong. It means that I have a relationship with you. You and I have to belong together in relationship with one another. And we have to have agency in how we're shaping the society, how we're shaping the communities, and so forth. And so that's really sort of at the core of a lot of the work that I've had the privilege of doing. And so I was thinking a little bit when they were saying sort of like, how did you start this work? And I just came back from New York. I was at the margins of the UN General Assembly and escaped back to be with you good people, thank God. But while I was there, I had dinner with a Naga human rights defender who's a very old friend, and so I sort of thought I'd start there. I don't know if many of you have heard of Nagaland. Anybody in this room heard of Nagaland? Oh, excellent! I love this crowd. Fantastic. So for those of you who don't know, the Naga are an indigenous community, a trans-border community between the northeast of India and Myanmar. And I had the great privilege of working with a Naga human rights defender, and that's sort of how I started in this work. And so just thinking a bit about what I learned from those spaces and what we can learn when we think about inclusive communities. So this is in the late 1990s, and I was working in support of the Naga in their dialogue with the government of India for a ceasefire. But at the same time, this is a community that had been fighting a war of separation for almost 60 years when I was there. It was a community that had almost 100% support for the self-determination struggle, and at the same time, they were hopelessly divided internally. It's a community and a set of nations that have had extraordinary traditions of consensual democracy and dialogue throughout their traditions, and they couldn't talk to one another. And the civil society and the armed resistance and political leadership were at complete odds with one another, and they were frozen in the midst of a horrific conflict. And so one of the things that we were asked to do was, with the Quakers, put together a series of dialogues between Naga civil society and their own political and armed resistance, and spent a lot of time telling stories. And what really came out was that the people in the communities, the civil society, the mothers, felt that they were holding up the entire society in communities that were under siege from the government of India, the Indian army, on a daily basis, and they felt abandoned by the armed resistance. The armed resistance was in the forest, they were in the bush, they were in the mountains, and they were fighting every day, and they were being captured and tortured, and they felt that they had been abandoned by their society, and they were making the ultimate sacrifice. And everyone felt deep, deep pain and trauma. They felt that they were making the ultimate sacrifice for one another, but in struggling for one another, they'd lost one another. And when I look back now, this is almost 30 years ago that I was doing this work, what was more transformative was the dialogue between Naga within their own communities than it was even between Naga and the government of India, which did eventually result in a ceasefire. Still huge problems in the communities. But when I look back on that, it's a reminder to me that often what's right in front of us, what doesn't necessarily ideologically divide us, is the space that we have to start in. That too often we think that we're fine in our own communities and that we don't need to reach as far as we need to reach. But these divisions creep up on us, and they can be very real, and we have to have difficult and complicated conversations, and we have to bear the pain with one another and see that pain with real humanity. And when we do that, we can see really extraordinary results. And I've been reflecting on that a lot since I came back to Canada, which was only a few years ago. I lived away for most of my life. And I feel a little bit like some of these divisions are creeping up on us here, and we don't know really what to do to have these kinds of difficult conversations and dialogues. And in a strange way, a lot of the places I've worked that are in conflict, in really violent and existential conflict, including Sudan, which I would remind us is the world's largest protection and humanitarian crisis on the planet in this moment. But they're required to have dialogue because it feels so existential in that moment. And I think sometimes in Canada, our comfort has gotten in the way of us having some really, really tough conversations. So that's just sort of my first reflection that I wanted to kick off the conversation with. And Mohammed, I'm going to pass over to you.
Your last line kind of threw me off for a second because I had a prepared thing, but because there's a difference between safety and discomfort. And sometimes as Canadians, we kind of get discomforted and we're like, our safety is no longer there. But and that's kind of like the space we need to curate to be able to have more difficult conversations that evolve into what could be peaceful resolutions to things. I think probably that's the only place that does exist where peace could happen. Like peace doesn't happen with like homies hanging out. I mean, it's already peaceful. But you create peace through walking through fire with each other eventually and finding that ground. For me, I find every day I feel weird about where I'm sitting all the time. Because I come from a community organizing background. Like I was a student union activist, I was like a community activist. And then eventually I joined the labor movement and worked there for 10 years before, for some odd reason, the government of Canada is saying, here's a crown corporation, go sort it out. Very odd. And I was not even an anti-racist activist, to be honest. I was doing union stuff, which is all about economics. But through that, there's a lot of stuff that can happen as well in this field. So for me, it was, I'm a product of 9/11. Like 9/11 happened, and all of a sudden, I became the other. And I'm like, what happened? I thought we're okay here, but clearly we're not. And I lived through that, having the experience of constantly being, questioning my own. Oh, I can't go to that mosque because I don't know. I've heard weird things about this. So let me self-select myself away from my own community, or let me all this Bill C-51 or different laws that are being implemented. Are they targeting me? It feels like they're targeting me. It's like, geez, this is they'll take away citizenship for people who are dual citizens because if they get charged with terrorism. I'm like, is that a way for to take out Muslims? It's like, what is happening here? Or let's introduce a snitch line for barbaric cultural practices. Does that mean are they gonna call a snitch? Is there gonna be a snitch line for my niqabi friend? What is happening over here? Canada had become a place where it felt like the laws of the land had turned against me. So I started pushing back against that back in 2014 is when I got really ticked off, and I'm like, I got to put my organizing hat, and because I've been trained as an organizer for 15 years before that, and let me address Islamophobia in a way that I feel is impactful. So I started doing that, and then on January 29th, I got a call from Amir Al-Gawabi, who's currently Canada's Special Representative on Islamophobia. I think that's her official title, but she is also a longtime homie. And so she called me, and she was working on the National Council of Canadians, and I was sitting at home, and she's like, hey, turn on the news. 6 people got shot in Quebec City. Drop what you're doing and head over there now. And I'm like, okay. I should text my boss. I may not come in tomorrow. So I texted him and said, yeah, I gotta go. He's like, yeah, okay, no problem. I'll sort it out. And then, so I got to Quebec City the next morning, and obviously, for me, that was extremely emotional. There was a 6-year-old girl who was, outside the mosque, and her mom was there to pick up the car, and she was talking about her shoulder hurting. And her shoulder was hurting because she was in the mosque the night before when the gunman came in. And she was playing, I don't know if people have been to mosques, but the kids are always causing ruckus at the back. And it's super annoying because you're trying to pray and people are hushing the back and forth. But this happens, Mohammed, you know this, regularly. This is like the scene. So that's what was happening. And then the gunman came in and he started shooting everybody. She saw her own father getting shot in the back. The gunman turned the gun to shoot at her, and he pulled the trigger, but he had run out of bullets at the time. Her shoulder was hurting because the men at the back of the mosque, when they heard her, what was happening, ran to the children to shield them. Reliving that's a bit of a thing. I've seen bloody carpets and bullet holes. So to me, this work is deeply personal. So that's how I came into this work. And then for some odd reason, in 2020, the government's like, hey, we would like to appoint you as the head of this foundation. Please go work on that. We had 4 people at the time. Our budget was $800,000. We had been in existence for 25 years, but we had struggled. And I said, okay, well, what do I do? I know what to do. And then we built a machine. Now our budget is close to 15 million. We get our appropriations from Parliament. For the first time ever, we have permanent appropriations, which is something, thank you. And we've built a pipeline. And we're continuing to build this pipeline because we sit at a very interesting intersection. Because we're part of the federal government, we see policy windows that are open and closed. Which ones are really open and which ones are really closed because we're inside of it. So we can see, the Black Canadian Justice Strategy is happening right now. There's going to be money attached to it. There's going to be legislation attached to it. What's going to work? What's not going to work? How do we intervene? Who's doing what? Who's saying what? What conversations are happening with what political offices? What's happening with the different foundations that are working on these issues? What are the different levers that we can pull to be able to push the things forward? So we have a very unique opportunity to see this. Yesterday, I was standing next to a whole litany of MPs who came up there to take credit for the work that I did. I'm kidding. God, we wouldn't exist if it weren't for that.
It's a good sign when they try to take credit.
It's good, yeah. There's a whole series of them anyways. But we announced Canada's action plan on combating hate. This is something I had worked on for 3 years. So being in the room, being on the ground the day after a massacre, to watching, standing there and watching this national action plan, they announced $273 million towards addressing hate. I can comfortably say at least 160 of it were either our ideas, ideas they stole from us, ideas we pushed them and prodded them to create. So thankfully, that has moved forward. And it feels like a bit of a whole circle moment where enough of thoughts and prayers, let's move the country forward. Let's move it in a way that is constructive. We don't, as our organization, we don't speak a lot, we speak very calculatedly because we don't put out condemnation statements, which everybody is always asking me, hey, where's your statement on A, B, C, D, E, F, G? And I'm like, which one do you want to talk about? Like we see 40 different things happening every single day across this country. So if you want me to create a Canadian Race Relations Foundation for condemnations of everything in Canada, let me fire everybody and just have a comms department to condemn everything. Or let's move on policy change. So that's kind of where we're at. That's where I come from. That's why I'm here. And hoping that this conversation, which honestly I'm really inspired, to be frank. I think that the PFC has taken steps to invite difficulty into the room, where technically and like practically, it's hard to have these conversations in places where there's wealth, where there's comfort, where people know what they're doing and feel good about how they've done it for a long time. I can tell you, like I was meeting with the big boss back in January, and like sometimes when you're doing something for so long, you gotta feel like people can trust you to do the right thing. And so you gotta take it a bit for granted that people should just trust you because you've been doing it, you've been putting your life and soul into this thing. You've lost your marriage, you've put your kids like on the sidelines, like you've invested your entire being towards improving something, to deliver something. And then when people are not responding to that, you feel like, come on, man. Come on. I've tried. And I think that sometimes in philanthropic circles, I feel that to be true too. Like that desire to do good is alive. Sometimes when a bunch of us show up, things get a bit spicy.
When you said I thought we were okay here, that has reminded me of so many different spaces that I've been in where there's been a veneer of something and it's been shattered. And then there's an opportunity to do it better the next time. And I have to say that I think most of the places that I've been, we haven't done it better the next time. So when I was working for Kofi Annan, I was living in Kenya and had been living there for many years. And there was a myth in Kenya too that we were in this sort of post-ethnic Kenya and everybody could get along and nobody cared whose community anybody was from and so on and so forth. And then things were bubbling under the surface, maybe not so under the surface. I think a lot of us didn't always want to see it around the elections in 2007. And when you saw the eruption, I mean, it was a match on an absolutely ready set of kindling. And it was fast, and it was across the country, and it was hitting all of that fear and all of that, you cannot be like me. This is my country, this is my society, how dare you? And all of these cleavages against self-interest as well, right? And we put the mediation process together, and largely the cork got put back in the bottle, but we used to always say the pressure that blew the cork off the first time was still there. We didn't release the pressure. We just recorked the bottle. And if anybody's following the Gen Z protests now and what's going on in Kenya, that's part of the pressure. It's a different set of pressures right now. It's a pressure I'm actually a bit more optimistic about right now in Kenya, but the pressure is still there. And I feel like we always miss that. And so what do we do to have different conversations now that get us to that place? I've seen this opportunity over and over again. The revolution in Sudan was an opportunity that we all believed in, and it was extraordinary. And it was like, if you want to talk about the power of collective action, it was unbelievable. But we are now in a situation of total collapse. So what do we do in these moments of opportunity? Because I think that the crisis in Canada right now, which is that we know the social fabric is fraying and we don't get to pretend that it isn't, is what do we actually do in those moments? And I know I'm trying to have some fidelity to Jean-Marc and Andre are sitting over there staring at us, of the actual questions you wanted us to answer as we chat. But like, what has been transformative this year about seeing people who are able to talk about these issues when you think people can't talk about these issues? And that's something I've been thinking about. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's been really hard to hold hope. I mean, I can't remember politicians reminding me to feel inspired in a long time. I've felt angry from social media. I feel angry from news. I feel annoyed about different things, but I don't normally feel inspired by voices around me. I hear lots of condemnations. I hear lots of everything, but it's difficult. It's extremely difficult. I went to the Toronto Holocaust Museum opening a little while ago. I think it was almost a year ago. And this lady named Naomi, I can't remember her last name, gets up there and says, you know, you die twice. Once when you actually die, and the second time when your name is mentioned for the last time. And I thought about that, and I'm like, who's talking about George Floyd now? No one's talking about George Floyd. I haven't heard his name anywhere. I think a lot of the work that I see out there, started off in a way and got a catalyst like it never did before because his murder. And we don't talk about that. And I'm not saying that's a positive thing to talk about, but we have to figure out, you know, what are the opportunities to move things forward in moments where there are those moments of crises. And I think that, like what you said in terms of recorking the pain versus exploring it is critically important. Critically important. And I don't think that happens unless we're able to hear and feel for others who we assume to be our enemy.
You know, you mentioned, Justin, you mentioned Verna was here to open, who's so phenomenal. And one of the things that Verna said to me a while ago was that we feel like we are in a place of scarcity in our society, emotional scarcity, resource scarcity, scarcity overall. And when you come at things from a place of scarcity, we're following the wrong instincts. We're following the instincts to say, what's mine is mine and how dare you, and I don't have time to have empathy for you. I don't have enough empathy to have empathy for you. But actually, that in times of scarcity, in times of real scarcity, the thing you actually have to do is collaborate and kind of come together in some of those spaces. But Mohammed, something else that you just mentioned that I've been thinking a lot about, I get to be around a lot of people that really, really deeply inspire me and do really amazing things. I know. I have the best job. And one of the ways, so at the Global Center for Pluralism, every 2 years, we give something called the Global Pluralism Award. We award 3 winners and 7 honorable mentions, so we have 10 laureates every 2 years. And they're just phenomenal pluralist leaders from around the world, organizations and individuals. And I just learn so much from them. And just a couple, because I think it just, to your point on listening and how we do that. So Dia Khan, I don't know if anybody in this room knows Dia, is one of our laureates from last cycle. She is a Norwegian documentarian. She's of Pakistani heritage. And she speaks to the extremes. And she interviews jihadists and she interviews white supremacists. She was at Charlottesville by herself, pregnant, interviewing white supremacists in those moments. And her practice, which we got to witness when we were working with her around the award, is she sits and she just asks questions. Mm-hmm. And she draws them out, and she draws them out, and she draws them out. And she said to me many times that what you find under all of the spaces of hate, and she listens and sits with things that are, I can't even imagine having those things said in my presence. And she said what she gets to at the end of the road is desire for belonging, a belief that that was rejected or taken away, a sense of humiliation and loss that's at the core of the personal story every time. And her point is not to excuse any of those things, but to try to figure out how we understand them so that we can do something with that understanding in order to change why that radicalization sits where it sits and why people sit at the extremes. So just another of our awardees is an organization called Build Up. They're a digital peace-building organization, and they did a test online a while ago. They had a group of them, and they said they were going to intervene in some of the most hateful online conversations, Twitter, Facebook, and they would find these feeds, and they wanted to test and see what would de-escalate the vitriol. And the only thing that de-escalated the vitriol was when somebody would engage and say, "Tell me more." And what Helena said to me, again, about it last week, is she said, people stop shouting if they think someone's listening. And I think we feel like we're more inundated with all of this information and connected, but we're disconnected. And so it's how do we get back to those places where we are doing that listening? And I feel that often we struggle because it also feels like by listening, you are acknowledging and allowing hateful speech. And I think that's a real dilemma, right? Because we also have to come to places where we can understand people that we deeply, deeply disagree with. And all of us talk about being in uncomfortable spaces, and all of us talk about the need for dialogue. But when it comes to somebody who is saying something that is at your core, something you object to, it is unbelievably, unbelievably hard. I don't have an answer to that, but that's, I think, one of the real dilemmas that all of us have to face if we're going to talk about really inclusive communities.
Yeah, I think all of us have also received calls to say, hey, cancel this person or cancel that person because they've said A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or they've taken a position on that. I'm not too sure if any funders here have received such calls. Please don't put up your hand. But because I think the expectation is for things to just, like, we cancel them and they go away. That's not going to happen. That's not going to change anything. You know, we were watching the encampments extremely closely. There were huge differences between how policing was happening in different places, how different injunctions were being adjudicated upon. And I think that, and like the degree of vitriol that existed in them, the degree of hate speech that potentially or could or should have been noted, and the degree of violence that came from policing and the dismantling of them, but also how different universities reacted to it. And I think that, you know, U of T was an interesting case because, like, when the judge said get out, like, I think everyone kind of expected that was going to likely happen because at some point encampments just can't go on forever. So therefore that was relatively expected. But they said that, like, the judge in his statement was very clear in terms of like how he had not felt that the thing was hate motivated. And I actually think the reason why they packed up and left on their own once they got the notice was not because of like legal recourse. I think it's because they were acknowledged to say, you're not hate mongers. And that's difficult to hear for people, I get that. But I think that was a civil cleaning off of, like, not cleaning off, but like a way for it to end in a way that I think it ended and people left peacefully. I see this all the time in the space that I work in. I think that what's difficult, but I think what needs to happen is, look, if we're gonna vilify people for whoever they are, as you said, the reaction to that is those three things, because that vilification will exist. And I'm not saying you need to humanize with absolute insane nuts, but I think that like at the core of things, there are things that need to be extracted and dealt with. I think philanthropy has a big role in this, because like governments can't do it. Do not count on government to solve this for you. I just helped, we helped write the online harms bill. I promise you, for the next 7 to 10 years, ain't nothing changing. because by the time you have a digital safety commission, you have an ombudsperson, by the time they come on board, they become functional, they create safety plans come back, they get adjudicated on, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I mean, like my kid will be in high school. So don't expect that to be the case. I think civil society, particularly philanthropy, has the freedom to, and you are all extremely risk averse, as am I, and I get it. Reputation is paramount. But I also think that we need to open up the space for discomfort and invest in it. Because I think that if you think that this will get solved on its own, it's not going to. People, after October 7th, the week after, I'm like, haul the imams and the rabbis into the office. So we got the bunch of them together. And I'm like, tell us each other what are things that the other community needs to know about your community right now that will be an uncomfortable truth for them to hear. Why did you not condemn October 7th? Why was there this? Why was there or that? All these different questions. We're like, throw it all on the table. Talk to each other. So they did. And they all afterwards like, oh, I didn't see it that way. I'm like, at the end of it, I got one request for you. Take one thing that as an uncomfortable truth back to your congregation and share that one thing when you're on the pulpit. One thing only. I checked in afterwards. Guess how many people did anything? I think sometimes there are times when that conversation can happen, and there's time where there's just too much trauma in the room.
And I think that point of like where the spaces are and not assuming that every space is a space to throw everything in is something that we all have to recognize when we think about how we're actually building out these spaces. Right after the war reemerged in South Sudan in 2014, a group of women from all different sort of spaces in the conflict got in touch with me. I was based in Nairobi at the time, and asked me to convene about 50 of them because they said, we need to talk, we need to stop this. Everything is descending into total madness. And it was the wrong decision. And they took the decision, but it was the wrong decision. There was so much trauma in the room. There were things that were happening as we were talking to their families, and it was too raw and it was too awful. Even though it was a private space and there was 50 people, it was too many people from too many communities at that moment. But I think there's also a way, and I really agree with you about the importance of philanthropy and other non-governmental spaces in this, is that we have to find all of the different spaces in which this can happen. And they can be small spaces and they can be big spaces. I think you were in some of the conversations that I've had with Amira and others where we said actually private spaces are also really, really powerful, that sometimes we need to start in spaces where we're not being live streamed, where somebody isn't tweeting everything that we say or Xing, is that what you call it? Everything that we say, but that we're figuring out ways to be raw with each other and then broadening that space out and broadening that space out. And what does give me a little bit of hope within some of this is I have seen these spaces happening in other places. And interestingly for me, because I know how much this is tearing people apart here, and I know how much it's tearing people apart there, I also see phenomenal dialogue and organizing going on with Israeli and Palestinian peace activists in the region. And some of the work that's being done by some of the foundations that I'm in touch with in Israel, in Palestine, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in the wider region, are doing extraordinary things, and they're having unbelievably hard conversations with one another every day. And I feel like that's an example that we should all, in this moment, with incredible humility, follow and support.
Yeah, I mean, I caught a little bit of the session earlier today with Bashar and Nikki, and they used language around collective security. I was a bit jarred by that because honestly, like in my world, I never heard that term applied to this by anybody. And I felt, whoa, that's incredible. I think that because like, I mean, Bashar, you're from the West Bank, right? Where exactly in the West Bank are you from? Ramallah, okay, perfect. Yeah, it's, I mean, I felt, it was jarring because I felt hope. Like in a long time around this stuff. I talked to too many people who want to tear too many things down. And sometimes I want to be in that space too. But I did not feel that what I felt today. So I just want to acknowledge the brave souls that walked that land, and I give a nod to the PFC, but also to Bashar and Nikki. Let's give them a round of applause for it. Because they got to hold some insane stuff in their hands. Look, I think that the time, like I believe, like, so for me, like my dad came in 69, passed away in 84. My mom at that time was working full time and going to school at nighttime. So I basically was like brought up in a chain smoking Irish woman's house named Gertie across the street in Beaches, East York. My understanding of Canada is the love that I felt from Gertie. Like that was like my second mom. Like I was there when all of it. And I believe in the project. I believe in the project of Canada. As much as its horrific history has existed and exists today. This morning, I was with the First Nations group who is currently experiencing, I'm not even going to say it. I don't want to say it. It's not my story to say. But extreme pain. Extreme pain. And no one's talking about it. No one's talking about it. And I know that like, the wrongs of this country are many, but the future of this country is unwritten. And it belongs to you and I. And how we manifest our destiny is incumbent on a couple of things. One is, we say sorry a lot, which is a bit annoying, but kind of love it. Because like, you know, it's admittance of fault. And then, but there's a road from sorry. Like if it's just sorry, then it's no good. But if it's like sorry with action, that's good. Like, and the second thing is we have a bit of an angel complex. We're not as racist as the Americans are. And the rest of the world, we're multicultural. We're so much better than everybody else. Come on now. Which is really silencing for many racialized communities. Let's be clean here. Because it just says, hey, keep your mouth shut. You ain't got that bad. Let's be real here. But it also stokes our collective responsibility, which is we have to be the angels in this world. As idealistic and stupid as that sounds, I kind of still believe in it. Yeah.
But I think, Mohammed, we don't have a choice, right? And I think that just maybe if I could end on that idea of belief, was with some colleagues from A Land for All, which are one of the Israeli-Palestinian peace movements I was mentioning, and they're talking about what a shared future would look like that's actually belonging centered for everyone on that land. And one of the struggles that they have is that that future is so far away that it's hard for people to invest in and imagine when awful things are happening now. And I think what we also need to figure out a way of balancing is that belief and that determination that that's where we have to get to, but figuring out what the small steps are in the midst of real difficulty right now that all of us can do together, right? And it's being able to do both of those things at the same time.
We just got to own our own. And Justin's here to kick us off. So the last thing I'll say is, look, that future is unwritten by all of us. It's not up to government or whatever, or politicians. It's honestly, it's up to all of us. And until we take that responsibility and walk into the discomfort, like if you're feeling rage because you have dead family members across on the other side of the world, to be frank, I feel you. We cannot shut it all down. We have to create the space for people to come to those listening moments, to come to those hearing moments, and figuring out a way forward, because that's the only way we will survive as our collective project. Thank you.
Thank you both. Wow. I'm not here to kick you off yet. I'm just here to give space for people to ask questions so you can talk some more. So that's there's a couple questions, but pull your phones. We're only going to do it on the app. So if you don't have a phone, which maybe there's a couple people in here, you have to talk to someone and get them to put the question in for you. So I'll give it a second or two for some questions to populate here. But just quickly, a reflection for me, a couple things that really stood out. And Meredith, you said people stop shouting if people are listening. I don't know if I wrote it down exactly right, but there's a line, for folks who were here on day one in the opening. Rita also spoke about the importance of listening and of us taking the time to be in relationship and to understand and truly listen, not just sort of a passive hearing of stuff and dismissing it, but truly listening. And so for me, sort of hearing that, at the beginning and at the end just really, really is striking. And Mohammed, a lot of things from both of you. I'm struck and feel really fortunate to have been here to listen to you both. But I think something for philanthropy really is risks, is that we are in a unique place in society to take risks that other people are unable to. And for me, I think about that a lot, and it requires taking risks. There's gonna be failures. Things are not gonna go the way we thought they might go. The thing that someone wrote in a grant application, 3 months ago that you finally reviewed is not gonna go exactly as you thought it was gonna go, and that's okay. We have to take risks, accept that, but what can come from that risk taking is something much more transformative and impactful. There's one thing, a question I had, as I'll read some others from other folks too, but I hear it a lot. I hear it a lot in the work that I do in, really trying to build new relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country, and talking to non-Indigenous people who often feel unsure, they feel scared, they feel overwhelmed by both what's happened and feel lost in not knowing what to do and are scared to make a mistake. And I think that's the case for a lot of people dealing with a lot of polarization, a lot of tension, a lot of, people who may have the best aspirations for our country, but are scared to do something wrong and so do nothing. Not expecting you both to give people exactly what they need to do, but I'm interested in any advice or reflections you have for how people might step outside of that.
Just also, Justin, if I can say, and Rita, we have the great honor, sits on our Global Pluralism Award jury, so she gets to select all these amazing, inspiring people that we work with. Just to the point of risk, I think there's also something to connect there with trust. And, a lot of the Sudanese communities that I work with are doing the work right now. They're protecting their communities. They're negotiating with predatory military on the ground to make sure that they're slightly less predatory tomorrow. They're trying to figure out how to get food into communities that have been displaced. They're doing it, but they're not getting the cash transfers because there isn't enough trust. Just as an example, right? Sometimes that risk has to be about how do you trust and be in relationship with the communities that you serve, and we really see this. I hear this question a lot, Justin, about people feeling paralyzed because they don't want to make the wrong move. And one of the things I find really interesting is often there's a lot of us who exist in this space and so therefore are more comfortable and can be one of the first bridgers to people to say, ask me all of your stupid questions, your so-called stupid questions, and I'll tell you if that question is in fact offensive or if that is just, honestly, you're just trying to figure it out and you're trying to get there, and sort of learning and reading and all of that. And I know, from us as an organization for September 30th, one of the things that we do is put out a series of engagements and educational resources and that sort of thing for our entire team and everyone to just spend time just learning a little bit more, because we can all sort of learn and engage in those spaces. But I do think it's scary right now to take the first step, and I would say that it exists around reconciliation, and it exists around so many questions today that we don't feel like we're allowed to ask a question without getting in trouble, without getting canceled, right? And I think part of all of our leadership is it's incumbent on us to kind of take back that space, because it didn't used to be that hard to ask a question and open, I think, Mohammed, what you were saying earlier, recognizing people's good intent, right? And getting back to like the benefit of the doubt. I know I sound like a mom to my kids, but God, how many times do I say that every week? But it is pretty straightforward to see good intention in someone else. And just one last thing I would say, because it's been rolling around in my head a lot since I moved back to Canada. And Ubuntu, for some of you who worked in Africa, will understand that philosophical concepts around belonging and around existing in relationship with one another. And I don't exist outside of my relationship with you, with the community, with the land, and with all those connections, enables us to have a different space. And I think it's something that was everywhere where I worked across the African continent, and I felt like I could ask those questions there, and I don't feel like sometimes I can ask them here. And that says something to me about the fact that we've lost the ability to be in relationship with one another.
Yeah, I think that you gotta, you gotta have your partners. You can't, if you're too scared to do it by yourself, find another person to do it with. I mean, I'm married. I'm right now sitting between a 2.7 and a 3.5 in terms of job satisfaction as a husband.
What's the scale? 100?
Out of 10.
100 or?
Out of 10. But man, I'm telling you, I would be screwed if I was doing it by myself. So, like, you got to figure out how to roll with people that are close to you. You got to find the people who are going to walk with you. Like, let's do a little exercise. Everyone's got a cell phone. Write one brave thing that you will do to curate something that is difficult for you to see. I'm going to take 30 seconds. Go, please, use your phones. And then we'll do a hand up to see who's going to share one thing. But, like, can I get some buy-in on this one? I see nobody moving. All right, maybe afterwards. Go to your question, bro.
Thanks, Mohammed. We'll come back to it. We'll circle back to it. Give people some time. So there's a couple questions I want to sort of highlight. So one, I think you've spoken to a little bit, but it's got 11 likes on the app. It's blowing up. What recommendations do you have to bridge the divide between Indigenous peoples and broader Canadian society, particularly in the context of misinformation funding disparities?
Look, I think all my relations means being in relations. If you're not in a relation, don't show up. But unless you want to be an actual relation. It's not incumbent on Indigenous folks to go reach out to you and try to get funding. Like, you know, this country was built on colonization. We've extracted so much, including hope. Those are our actions. I benefit from that. You benefit from that. So we got to go figure out a way to build the relationships that we can, in every way possible we can. This is the worst. I hate saying the worst because I never say the worst on anything because everyone's like, oh, Mohammed, you're playing oppression Olympics and whatever. But like, look, the wrong that has been done here needs to get reconciled. It's not on Indigenous peoples. It's on you. It's on me. And we got to figure out what our relationships are and just show up. Like this morning, I was telling you, it's like they were talking to, this folks from Northern Alberta who I have a very close relationship with, a lot of mental health issues in the community, lots of things happening there. They were here for some Indigenous policing contract. Like, I'm fairly well connected. They're like, hey, we don't have our contract with the RCMP done. We've been pushing and pushing. Can you help us out? I'm like, yes. So we got them a meeting with the assistant commissioner for the RCMP was in charge of all Indigenous policing. Like, they were trying to get, like, ISC to see somebody, so we set up something with their minister's office and their deputy minister's office. Today, we just gotta, if you're in a relationship, show up the best way you can. And like, but if you're not in a relationship, then that's on you. You gotta sleep all night. But you gotta build that relationship now, or if it's already too late.
But also there's a million ways to do it, right? And it doesn't have to be just one way. I have some colleagues that run a commercial real estate firm, and they have been trying to figure out, so what do we do? And I said, well, you deal in land. So like there's a place to start, right? But it's figuring out where you can actually engage in those spaces, and it's gonna look different for everyone, right? If you're in the healthcare sector, that's obviously a different space. There's always these spaces. But one other thing I would say that, I mean, I know people in this room already know, but one of the things that comes out really strongly in a lot of the work that we do, both here in Canada, but also in Colombia and other places with Indigenous communities, is also recognizing the nation-to-nation relationship and the value of that. That this is not charity. This is not, it's asymmetrical in other ways, but it's not asymmetrical in terms of the principles, and that has to be really recognized if you're actually going to make those kind of moves.
Also, isn't there the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund in the House too? Are there folks
Yeah,
from that
there are.
fund? Yeah, can you just, like, because like they know better than I do, so please work with them to see how you can make it, like, build those relationships in places you don't know.
Yeah, thank you both. And just because I have the mic and the moderator and all the power, I get to also answer the question. I think something that's so important, and it links to the question I asked as well, is sort of you have to take risks as non-Indigenous people to be open to the wisdom, expertise, and knowledge that our people have. That we know what we need, and the responsibility of all of those in relationship with us or aspiring to be in relationship with us is to listen, to learn, and for all the funders in the room, which is all of us, give abundantly and without restrictions. But in follow-up, I have one last question. I'm way over time. And you see, look, Jean-Marc was like, it's way over time. I want to ask one question. I'm going to combine two questions because they've both got lots of thumbs up, and I think they're linked. So I'll do my best to try to bring them together. So the first one is, much of philanthropy tends to focus on folks that are marginalized, folks that have been excluded intentionally, experience oppression, and the question is sort of kind of flipping that, is like, investing in the power in our communities is so important, but alone, how do we think about those who are resistant to that? So what is the role for philanthropy in helping shift perspectives of folks who may be anti-trans or resistant to Indigenous rights or racist or whatever? And so what, in your minds, is the role of philanthropy in bridging that gap, in helping those people see a different path forward? So there's that, and it sort of links to a question that's really kind of a little bit more general, but in terms of like bridging divides. And so really, like, in your minds, what is the role that philanthropy plays or can play in building those bridges across different perspectives to build a more equitable, a more inclusive, and a more just country?
Well, the power question is a huge one, and I know another friend and colleague, some of you may know, Rose LeMay, said to me one time, she said, your responsibility is you get invited into rooms I don't get invited into, and you have to make sure that you use that responsibly to advance the things that you and I have talked about that you say you believe in. And I've really held that, and I think that there's really something to that piece, which is that I would assume, and I don't know this to be true, but I would assume that philanthropic foundations get to be in a lot of spaces that marginalized communities don't get to be in, right? So part of that is that, and how do you utilize that? But how do you utilize that in a smart and strategic way? And I would just say, as a sort of parable to this, I mentioned before the revolution in Sudan, which was a truly phenomenal moment of human collective action. The thing it did not do was unseat the power structures, the military-industrial complex that has run Sudan for more than 50 years, and it didn't do that. And those of us who are helping didn't do that. And it's the reason we are in the war today, because it is that complex that brought the country back down. It's the same complex that brought Myanmar back down. And so, like, there are some pretty perilous journeys if you don't engage that space, is one thing. But if I could just say one other thing, is that I think it's also really important that we're not talking just to one another who we agree with. And I was recently, so I was at PeaceCon in DC a couple weeks ago, and they had a phenomenal panel on cross-partisan mobilizing to counter political violence in the United States. And you can imagine that PeaceCon in DC is a pretty lefty event. And there was a conservative Christian Republican from South Florida on the panel. And you could tell that she felt pretty alone in that room. And I was pretty impressed that she showed up and that she engaged. And one of the things that she and I were talking about afterwards, and they're actually doing really interesting work around trying to ensure that the election is accepted, is their core message. But one of the things she and I were talking about afterwards is the challenge of how do you talk to people with whom you have those deep barriers of disagreement? Because you can't talk in shorthand. You have to figure out ways of having a conversation when you're navigating almost triggering words on both sides all the time that are getting in the way of that conversation. And I think particularly when you have spaces of power and philanthropy, you will engage with people who disagree deeply with these things. Sit down and have a conversation and try to get underneath why they believe what they believe, because it will help you do your work better, even if you don't change their mind in that moment.
So I do work for the Government of Canada. So I understand a little bit about resistance. Look, I think that like as the philanthropy sector, you have significantly more freedom than we do. Like literally every word I put up on my stupid LinkedIn, it's sparsed. And if it goes sideways by 5% to 15%, let's just say 0% is perfect, no complaints, 5 to 15%, one letter to my minister saying I should get fired. So like, you got way more freedom than some of us do. Use it to curate braveness. Like there has to be that intention to be able to say, let's create brave spaces, let's roll with people who are gonna roll with us, let's find the differences, let's be in uncomfortable situations. Not too much, like honestly, I don't wanna be in too discomfortable situation, but like, you gotta go seek it. Because it's the only way it's gonna happen. But I just honestly, I need to say this. Yo, shit, it's not looking good outside there. It is getting rough. Sorry for my language. I work for the government. It's accepted in there. Like, it's normal. You should see how ministers swear. On the floor. Well, no. They get kicked out for doing it over there. But look, I think like the horizon that I see is extremely scary. Extremely scary. 68% of Canadians don't believe like that their like institutions are going to help them. You know, the degree of polarity is so high right now, and the online spaces are unsafe. Like, I don't know who has a kid between 10 and 15, but I bet you all of you are thinking, man, that cell phone in that kid's hand, I don't know. And it's real. It's real because like I didn't grow up with that. I was given a BMX and thrown outside the house, you know? Like, so go sort yourself out. Not a cell phone that could be extremely invasive. So I want you to understand the crisis at hand and your responsibility to address it. This is the moment when we move forward, if we have not already, and this is how we need you all to be braver in these spaces.
Thank you so much. Let's give these two a round of applause.